Right. Ollie, I'd like to start by saying thank you for joining me today. We're going to record a session around modern day slavery, and University of Liverpool is very committed to the development of understanding and supporting the legislation that we have in the UK. And I know you are dedicated to researching this area. So could you just introduce yourself and give us a little overview of where you've come from and why you're interested in this topic?
Certainly can, and thanks for having me as well. It's nice to be on the other side of interviews for once. Yeah, so as Deise said, my name is Oliver, but that's only when I'm in trouble. So most of the time people call me Ollie. PhD student at the University of Liverpool Management School. I actually started a relationship with the management school a few years ago when I did an MBA. And then, when was it? 2 years ago, got an ESRC scholarship to join Joe Meehan and Bruce Pinnington in the supply chain and operations department to study modern slavery in supply chains. And then first year PhD today, first year PhD this academic year, moving into second year, and yeah, doing my best to keep up with all the literature and the learning that's out there. And yeah, very happy to be here, Deise.
Thank you. Okay, so can you see my slides, Ollie? Just making sure you can see them.
I can, yes, I can.
Fabulous. So Ollie, you and I have had a chat about this, but my understanding so far of the research I found is there is approximately 24.9, nearly 25 million people who are enslaved, entrapped globally. And that breaks down to roughly 17.7 women and girls and 7.2 men and boys. I've put a link there on the slides that will take you through to a very recent case study that has gone to trial and also was successfully prosecuted. But I know there is issues around prosecution and finding this, and we'll later talk about this notion of an iceberg. We only see the top of it. But we then went on to explore the bigger number, this 40 million. And can you just give me a little bit of insight into the 40 million?
Yeah, so the organization where that numbers come from are people. It's an organization called the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization. The 40 million, it is slightly larger. Well, it's nearly double what you said initially, Deise, and there are specific reasons for that. That 40 million does include, as we say here, people trapped in domestic servitude, forced marriage, and different forms of forced labor as well. But within that 40 million, it is still true that that women and girls are more affected by modern slavery than men. And even within that, well, I suppose that segmentation comes both from the sexual aspects of the use of women, but we're down the gender line as well. Men and boys are used slightly differently to what women are. So you might see women enslaved more within fashion. You might see men enslaved more within construction or agriculture, although saying that agriculture is quite nicely spread across the two genders. But if you do look at the ILO numbers, they do go into a little bit more detail. And interestingly, so that the largest ever modern slavery ring smashed in the UK, that was an operation called Operation Fort. I think it was a couple of years ago. The lead detective was a gentleman called Nick Dale, and he's doing some wonderful work at the moment with various police forces across the UK to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to try to assist in prosecution of what we would call gang leaders or gang masters, who are the people who actually control potential victims of modern slavery.
Thank you very much. So I've done a slide here, and what I've tried to do is make the connection between something that's happening in our society and how we're dealing with it within the UK. And before anything goes into legislation, clearly there's usually an upsurge of cases, there's lots of evidence something is happening before it gets enshrined in law. And this is why, whilst the law was established and the Act was established in 2015, clearly it was happening way before then. What we needed was enough of a groundswell to enact some type of legislation. So here what I've used is a definition for enslavement, and this is specifically within the UK. The Charity of Hope and Justice has developed this. And they said modern day slavery as being where one person controls another by exploiting a vulnerability. It is often linked with human trafficking, where a person is forced into service against their will, usually forced work or prostitution. The control can be physical, financial, or psychological. So going back from that, what was happening was a number of cases were popping up all over the news. Police were involved heavily over a number of years. And the UK slavery bill was brought to Parliament. And in 2014, the modern day slavery bill was introduced in Parliament to ensure law enforcement was stronger, had stronger powers. Perpetrators received suitable severe punishment, and victims were better protected and supported. So it moved from a crime into a more systemic route of trying to resolve what is a societal issue. So that went through to the UK Parliamentary Act, which is a legal framework and the Modern Day Slavery Act 2015 was brought about. And going forward, if we refer to, we'll talk about the Act. The Modern Slavery Act requires all businesses with an annual turnover over 36 million to publish a yearly statement on modern day slavery and trafficking. And we'll talk about that later, because as you or I can, suggest, just because your turnover is 36 million doesn't mean that there is not modern day slavery happening either within your organisation or within your supply chain.
Yeah.
So it's a very high ceiling right now. We're hoping it comes down dramatically and it applies to all organisations, but at the moment that's where it stands. And at the moment you'll see you're required to produce a statement, and the statement identifies what steps the organisation is taking to ensure that modern day slavery and human trafficking are not taking place within its organisation or its supply chain. So at the moment it's very light touch legislation. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so just to go back and kind of build on your point that it was happening before this bill, it absolutely was. The reason that the Modern Slavery Act received royal assent and came into being, it was really to bring together what is being described as a patchwork of different legal systems. So there was potentially a separate bill or act that covered domestic servitude. There was another one that covered prostitution. And so really what the Modern Slavery Act was designed for was to bring it all together and make it, I suppose, with brevity, and make it more concise and simpler. And I suppose where, as management, students and scholars, where we are interested in, I mean, as people, we're interested in the whole thing, but as students and scholars, Section 54, to what you refer to about the 36 million threshold and above, Section 54 is essentially what covers organizational responsibilities within the Act. I suppose one of the comments I would have on that is how the Act changed through the years 2013 to 2015. Originally, it was almost a carbon copy of the Bribery Act. But as larger organizations got wind of this, they started lobbying for a watered down or distilled version of the Act that relied more on voluntary governance initiatives. And so this is where, and obviously they won, and this is where the light touch of the act actually comes in. The only thing that I'm aware of with regard to the statement is that it needs to be in a prominent place on a website or received in writing within 30 days. It needs to be signed off by a director, and as you say, identify what steps the organization is taking. But within that, it doesn't mandate any other details. So what an organization could do, and some do this, is simply state that the organization has not taken any steps. Now, obviously, there's a moral case against that, but this is where I suppose the light touch and the weakness of the bill does come in. However, at the other extreme, you have other organizations who are taking it more seriously and really embedding that a moral imperative in the work that they do, both in their operations and their supply chains.
Thank you, Ollie. And again, later we'll come into the professional bodies, specifically from a people management perspective, which is the CIPD. They are very, very clear around a leader's responsibility is an ethical responsibility as well as a management responsibility. So we'll pick that up hopefully later in our discussions. So next, why should HR professionals be concerned with this? And this is why I mentioned the CIPD. Alongside the moral and 2015 legal obligation, one of the core behaviours in the CIPD professional map is ethical practice. And it's been changed more recently to really embed this is the responsibility of all. So it's not just a manager's responsibility, it is the leadership responsibility of organisations, and we're all to be vigilant. And this is where HR in this scenario has a real choice to make here. They can make a real positive contribution, or they can step aside and leave it as an executive statement. So there's lots of activity organisations are taking, and we'll talk about the genre and why that might be in a minute. You can ignore the risks, but, and this is one of the issues, by ignoring them and not following your understanding of the legislation, you become inadvertently complicit if you do something. And therefore, if you think about your reputation with your own employees, your reputation with your stakeholders outside the organisation, it's very, very important in the contemporary workplace to really think about what is going on with slavery, because it is your sense of citizenship, your corporate responsibility now to recognise what's going on. There are practical steps you can take to reduce the likelihood of modern day slavery in an organisation in its supply chain, and hopefully Ollie will cover those later on. When you look at what has happened with the cases of modern day slavery, it is often seems to be a whole series of missed opportunities. And the missed opportunities quite often is when people management, HR specifically, could have stepped in, could have seen patterns, and this is where we look at data analytics and artificial intelligence. We could have often picked something up, we could have spotted it, even if we hadn't managed to completely identify what was going on at that point. So it is preventable when HR does its job. If we spot when lots of employees, for example, have got similar bank accounts registered to the same address, so there's a number of things we can spot that now are indicators, heat maps, if you like, of where it's happening. And this is where I mentioned the genres of HR and the link to modern day slavery. So the genres, if we think about HR that's in the workplace today, what is going on? We'd love to think there's all this contemporary HR partnership, but the reality is that there is sort of three genres. So there's this personal administration, personnel management genre, which goes back to the 80s, or typified by the 80s, where people management is very much just looked at as an administration focus. We hire, we fire, we retire, and we pay. Quite often you see that in heavy industry and the low skill industry, in the temporary contract type industry, or the gig economy. We have the human resource quite typified by the noughties, where we see people as a resource to be maximised. And again, you can imagine where slavery might come in there, because what we're looking is productivity focus. We're looking at profit focus rather than people, and we're not understanding our people as much as what they contribute and how much they contribute and the effort that goes in the workplace. And then we have very much the people partners, the contemporary HR that we're looking at, and this is where we're seeing a much more active body of HR practitioners really taking this quite responsibly, quite seriously, and doing their best. And remember, we're all on a journey. So people are partners in this type of contemporary context. Happy people, happy organisation, happy stakeholders would be the sort of nameplate, if you were going to give it a nameplate for that. But what we're actually finding is, whilst we are recognising it in the workplace, supply chain of resources, that's both your whole physical resource that's joining your organisation, but also the people who provide those resources, need to be included in this statement. So you need to go further than your own shores. You need to look beyond your organisational boundaries. And this is where we're getting this NIMBY, not in my backyard. People are making the assumption it's not there, when statistically we're finding it actually is. And this is some of the work you've done, Ollie. So this slide, commonality of observations, I've sort of put a few, but I'd like your interpretation on what you think about this, Ollie.
Yeah, I would agree with the list you've got there. There was just something that you mentioned just then, which I love, and I'm going to start using. What do you say, NIMBY? NIMBY. I love that. Not in my backyard. I suppose there's a question, because just previously we talked about organizational boundaries. Who's in the backyard? You know, is it just the people in your organization? Depending on the sector that you're in, one would like to assume that you've got quite a good view of what's going on within your organization. And then the tension with modern slavery is in that it's highly unlikely for a UK organization for modern slavery to occur in tier 1 of their supply chain, for example. Even their people supply chain, they might be using recruiters. What tier 1 means is anyone who you pay money to for a service or a good, upstream. Where modern slavery is most observed and where it does start to become problematic is in the danger zone of tier 4 to 7, for example. So they are the suppliers of the suppliers of the suppliers of your suppliers. So this idea of NIMBY, this not in my backyard, there's a real consideration of how far that backyard goes and who's in it and who's not. But then to come on to the commonalities of modern slavery, yes, low skilled work, but I think I might slightly change that to either sort of manual or menial work, in that it's rote, it's constantly repetitive. So it might be sewing in a factory in Bangladesh. It might be in Indian sandstone mines, for example, where the old-fashioned pickaxe and shovels are still being used. Picking strawberries in Europe, or picking oranges in Spain. So very much in places where, yes, it is low skill, but it is very manual work, and where that kind of work has not yet been replaced by automation, for example. Limited life choices. I suppose there's a spatial aspect to this in within geography. We could be looking very much at people from deprived socioeconomic backgrounds. We could be looking at countries that do have a weak economy. But then at the same time, I'm going to contradict myself and say that in the UK, for example, the UK government have something called a national referral mechanism, which basically is a bit of a blunt measure for the amount of potential slaves in the UK. And the highest number or the highest nationality of people on there is actually British people. So we have more British people identifying as slaves in the UK than any other nationality. So limited life choices, I suppose, is really linked to vulnerabilities. What opportunities are there around to actually engaging meaningful work? If it's not there, you might have a middleman, a broker, or a recruiter come along, say, hey, Ollie, you know what? I know there's no work here, but if you come with me, we cross the border to wherever we're going, there's loads of work there for you. Your economic or your social vulnerability means that you go along with it, and then all of a sudden you're in a foreign country under foreign laws, trapped in a DOS house with this guy who you thought was your friend. So vulnerability definitely does come into it, and it has been 100%. It has been exacerbated during the COVID pandemic as well. 100%. People desperate for work, turning anywhere just to put food on the table, to have money in the bank. Indebtedness, suppose that comes from what I just mentioned about the recruiter. Usually you might pay £2,000 to go to a new place of work in a different country. You don't have the money on you. The broker or the recruiter says, don't worry about it. You can pay it off by work when we get there. It'll take a month for you to pay off. But what they don't mention is the interest that they actually charge on that £2,000 that they loaned you initially. And it's a totally unpayable amount. So you end up getting trapped for years and years on end. Dependence for basic needs, I think that comes back to things that I've just mentioned. Now what you just mentioned, fearful, frozen, being found out creates anxiety. There's a really interesting, I suppose, case at the moment in the UK, and it is at the intersection with what's being described as a hostile immigration environment. Let's not go too much into what the media is saying and what's coming out of the government, but one thing that recruiters or gangmasters, and they're the people who own the slaves, what gangmasters are doing are threatening people in slavery with the police. They're saying, if you haven't got a passport, the police get hold of you, you're getting thrown in jail for 5 years. And so there's a real fear, even though these people are in conditions of slavery, there's a real fear for them to go anywhere else. They don't want to be in trouble with the police. They don't want to be deported, because at least they're getting some money, right? So there's a real tension in there as well. No agency, lack of perspective. I think I covered that before. Rather than sector specific, it is often linked to skill level. Yes, actually, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think going back to what I mentioned about COVID, it has been found in nail bars and car washes. There was a big campaign a few years ago. Nail bars and car washes is where modern slavery is taking place. But in the middle of COVID, nail bars all shut, car washes all shut. Well, what happened to those people? They didn't just disappear. No, they didn't disappear. What they did is they pivoted to other sectors or industry that required low skill. So all of a sudden, have you seen the amount of people who can now do deliveries? I don't think that's all above board. The amount of people who are working in warehouses. So yes, I would totally agree. It is linked more to the type of work than it is the sector. I mean, another example is that the sex work or the sex trade didn't actually die during COVID. It basically transferred to online, and the police have done fantastic jobs in shutting down all these sites. So is that list representative? Yes, Denise, I would absolutely say it is.
Fabulous. I've clearly been listening to to all of you. So thank you for going over that, because what I was trying to do is encapsulate the environment that these things could happen in.
Yeah.
So if we understand the environment, then actually we can start doing something about it, because this whole thing about, is it too much? Is it beyond our ability to do something about it? Well, we'd like to think it's not. But what we need to do is understand more, learn more before we can actually do something that's positive, as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah.
So and this leads on to the sort of propensity of it, because we've sort of talked about the cultural of how it can be created, how it comes about, but really, and this is why I've tried to introduce this an iceberg is, and you've talked about this, Ollie. It's we sort of know the black and white. What we don't know is what's below the surface is all the grey. And can you just explore this, because this is why we haven't put any exact slides on this for the UK, for other countries, for Europe, so we can look sector by sector because of the grey area. Could you just give us a little bit of your thought on this?
Yeah, so to continue with what I believe your line of thinking is, Denise, I suppose the first thing I would say is that there is a reason that it still exists, and there's a reason we haven't solved it. And it is because modern slavery lives just outside the boundaries of society. It lives in that grey area where we know it's happening, but it is illegal. And in some cases, until we know actually what's going on, there is very little that we can do about it. So yes, it is grey, and it is difficult, and I suppose that's why it has piqued academic interest. I mean, to give an example, so the Home Office a few years ago did, I suppose you could say, a propensity or a provenance exercise, and they estimated, it might have been 2012, 2013, it was early in the 2010s, and they estimated that in the UK there was 10,000 people who were potential victims of modern slavery. Now, as I mentioned before, the national referral mechanism, which is, we might talk about it a little bit later, but it is what the government uses to refer cases of potential modern slavery, hand them over to the police and the support services, and then try to rescue those people or alleviate the environments within which they live. Now, the NRM, National Referral Mechanism, last year registered over 10,000 potential victims of modern slavery. So you could sit here and go, well, a few years ago we estimated there'd be 10,000, and last year we found 10,000, so we must have found them all. Well, unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. I think there's a couple of things that could show. One, it could show that that old measurement is out of date and it is growing. Or two, it could tell us that original estimate was nowhere near the scale of the issue, what we're actually trying to deal with. So July last year, an organization called the CSJ, which is the Centre for Social Justice, they used a different methodology and came up with a different number. They came up with 100,000 people in the UK who are potential victims of modern slavery. Now, whether that number is right or wrong, I think for the purpose of this conversation is not necessarily important, but because what I think it does do, it highlights the scale of the issue that we're potentially dealing with. If you can imagine Wembley Stadium, where the England football team play their home games, and you imagine that stadium full, that's about the number of victims of modern slavery in the UK. So I suppose I'm trying to use the iceberg model that you have here. So that 100,000 or that 10,000 or whatever the NRM is saying at the moment, those are estimates, and those are what we might see above the surface of your iceberg model. What we don't see are the cases of modern slavery that don't necessarily fit neatly into the box. And this is, I suppose, where I'm not going to take this too far, but just to highlight that these debates are going on. At what point do we start talking about psychological enslavement as well? At what point do we start talking about working hours per week? At what point do we start talking about not paying the minimum wage? So whilst there are some things that we can do, there is still a lot of things that we don't know. And I think just to close the loop, it's why, Deise, you just mentioned then that it's, I am anyway, when I do my work, quite reluctant to try and quantify or put numbers down, because at the moment we kind of do have low confidence. What we do have, however, is knowledge of some sort of scale.
Okay, thank you. So that's great. So that's why it's always very challenging to put numbers. And my worry is, we've talked about this, if you put a number, does that minimize it? Does it say, well, that's okay, it's not grown? Or actually just knowing it's there is enough for us to start doing something about it?
Exactly. I think, whether it's 1, 100 or 100,000, if it was your brother, sister, your child, your mum and dad, one's enough.
Yeah.
One's enough.
Yeah. So then what I was trying to do, Ollie, with this is start introducing some type of case study for further research. And what we'll do, we've talked about doing a number of mini interviews so that we can talk about specific case studies. But I was just trying to raise some awareness of some of the areas you could go and research further. And I've put there battery supply. The cobalt industry is very, very closely linked to child slavery.
Yes.
We've put fashion and the clothing and garment sector, and again, that is linked to gender in slavery, and specifically, globally, it's a problem for everyone because we've gone into this very disposable fashion mechanism. But I know you have a Vivienne Westwood scenario case study that if we pick up in a minute, that would be great.
Yeah.
One of the big areas is the sesame seed and sesame production and the processing and the danger and the deaths and the maimings that come out of that sector, again, are very, very prolific, very dangerous. And enslavement, you wouldn't do it unless you had to do that job. It's not a choice necessarily, a life choice you would make.
Yeah.
And again, there's another case study that's been going on and rumbling on now for 10 years, which is this Foxconn, where we've looked at the tech, we've moved to these so many phones, they're so disposable, so one, it's not green because we're getting rid of so many, we go through so many, they're designed to last physically X length, 3, 5, 10 years. We are disposing of them on an annual basis almost, and that supply network is a big challenge. But also there is areas of hope on this slide as well, because and again, coming back to you, Ollie, hopefully we can pick up a couple of case studies, but I know Marshall Stones have done a huge amount on recognizing that the Indian stone they have in their supply chain was becoming a big issue around child male enslavement. They've really looked at their whole supply chain. It's a fantastic case study to be able to follow and see the contribution you can make, the good you can make, because it's not about just reporting it. It's about saying, well, actually, we're part of it. So how do we improve it? Iceland Frozen Foods, again, fantastic. They now really take their ethical responsibility of who's in their supply chain. And they've brought, this NIMBY, not in my backyard, they've brought their backyard into their organisation, said, actually, we're part of this. So we can be part of the solution instead of the problem. Prince's Food, I know, is one of your case studies, and hopefully we can have a chat on that. And Tony's Chocolonely, again, you've talked about. So if I go to the next slide, and I talk about a couple of case studies, and we try and just flush through your case studies using this structure so that we sort of get a few microcosms of this is what you're thinking right now in these. So one is some of the problems, but also some of the industries that have identified it and are now working through to resolution and become part of the solution.
Yeah, so I think whoops, me dropping my pen. I think just so I note down which ones I do want to talk about. I do want to talk about Vivienne Westwood. because I'm doing some work with Vivienne Westwood, and they've got a really interesting project going on at the moment. The other thing I'm going to talk about is Prince's, and then I do want to talk about a music festival as well. So Vivienne Westwood are if no one owns any of their clothing, who they are, they're sort of a mid to high market luxury brand, still run by the designer Vivienne Westwood herself. And the whole company really embodies who she is. So they're moving towards being very environmentally friendly. They don't test on animals. And then a few years ago, they started earwigging, modern slavery as another issue that needed to be dealt with. Now, as far as I'm aware, and I suppose this is a prime example of a pragmatic organization. As far as I'm aware, Vivienne Westwood have never discovered modern slavery in their supply chains or in their operations. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist there. It just means that they've never discovered it. But what they've done, and I believe what more organizations do need to do, is rather than wait for it to happen, is actually try to do something before it inevitably does show up somewhere. So what Vivienne Westwood, I suppose the issue that they were facing is that they know it's happening, they just haven't found it, and they don't know where it is. So, and I suppose the challenge to that is knowing where to start. Where does one start when potentially global supply chains all over the world, however many countries there are, however many workers in that supply chain? So we did a bit of work with them, and the project that we've been working on is almost a thinking about an organization differently. So usually what happens is that you have a product which is manufactured from multiple other products, which are manufactured from multiple other products. And that is essentially the supply chain, right down to the extractive layer, where the materials are extracted from the ground or otherwise. Now, usually all products are viewed in a linear way. So you have a supplier who has a supplier who has a supplier, which is great. And that's kind of just trying to link it back to genres. For a long time, that's how supply chains have been viewed as well. But what Vivienne Westwood is doing, and I believe quite effectively as well, is they're moving from the idea of a supply chain to a supply network, where they know maybe half their products all share the same suppliers, where they know that maybe Burberry, maybe Stella McCartney, and maybe the other big fashion houses actually use, as in we all use the same suppliers. So they've started really collaborating both between departments internally, between lines, and with their competitors as well, to move more towards a supply network. Because one of the big issues I think that firms are considering at the moment is, let's say they have 200 products. Where is the resource coming from to monitor 200, 400, 800 suppliers? Where's that resource coming from? And then the big excuse does come from organizations saying, I know the UK government want us to do this, and we want to do something about modern slavery, but we just don't have the resource. But what Vivienne Westwood have done is said, we don't need to monitor 800 supply chains. We all of us here, all these organizations, we need to collaborate and monitor one supply network. And it's not necessarily just within an industry as well. Everyone uses plastics. There's no reason why an agriculture firm and a fashion house can't both work together to try to monitor a supply network. So Vivienne Westwood have really thought outside the box and really opened the doors to what would be their competitors, which I think is a real big step. I do think it's a big step in the right direction. So just on something that Prince's Foods do, and I suppose this is in between. This is not necessarily proactive or reactive, but what they do is that when they're ordering cans of tomatoes from somewhere in Europe, by the way, they've done their research and they have data and they're leveraging that data as well. And they know if you pay someone fairly, this is how much a can of tomatoes should cost. And I suppose the argument to that would be, well, economies of scale means that the more you produce, the less it's going to cost per unit. But actually, economies of scale, if you follow that logic, eventually everything costs nothing. So the economies of scale argument doesn't quite work. So they know how much a can of tomatoes should cost from a supplier somewhere in Spain, for example. And what they've done, they've trained the procurement team, they've trained the supply chain teams internally, and they've started to flag their suppliers who are almost charging, who aren't charging enough. And it kind of goes backwards against the sort of the capitalist model that we currently live in at the moment. You know, organizations, if you follow Milton Friedman, are there to make a profit. So why would you push back against suppliers who are trying to charge you less? So it's coming into the organization and they're noticing it. It's one of their red flags and they're actually doing something about it. So that's kind of in the middle. I'm not going to name this this next organization for fear of getting in trouble or repercussions. But let's just say that they are a music festival somewhere in the UK. Now you think, where on earth could modern slavery happen in a music festival? And as I think we've tried to highlight today, it usually happens in the most unexpected places. So when I went to speak to this this music festival, and we're discussing modern slavery with them, you know, they kind of sat there and said, it doesn't happen. All we're interested in is putting the festival on, getting people in safely, getting the music done safely, and getting people home safely. But where we highlighted that it was most likely occurring was actually in their waste management supply chain. And I suppose, again, this is where not in my backyard comes in. At what point do potential slaves come into your backyard, and at what point should you start caring about them? My argument, obviously, with my background, should be immediately and all the time. But unfortunately, we don't live in a utopia. So we identified that it was most likely in waste management. And this was a big shock to them. But then a couple of weeks later, this is probably a case study that I should try and find for you. A big waste management company in the UK was found to be working modern slaves on their landfill sites and in their waste management complexes as well. Again, it comes back to manual menial labor, picking up rubbish, picking plastic out. So I suppose you might not be able to say, or there's a link that music festivals could be employing modern slaves at some point in their labor supply chain, but unfortunately they are. So I suppose three things that come out of this for me is look in the most unexpected places and don't expect it's just in your tier one suppliers. Try to leverage data as much as you can and collaborate as well. And it's not, you don't always have to collaborate in an organizational sense either. As an individual, you can collaborate. You can be working with the CIPD. You can be working with CIPS. You can be joining, I suppose, what would you call them, professional groups to try to share this as well. I think a lot of people, Denise, a lot of people think that they need to tackle something as bad as modern slavery alone. And I suppose what we advocate for is that it should absolutely not be alone. We're only going to solve this collaboratively.
That was fantastic. I find your case studies so interesting, Ollie. I could listen to them all day. I could, that's why we'll record a couple in more detail. But yeah, absolutely, absolutely fascinating. But the reality, what you're delivering time and time again, is there's a solution to this.
Yeah.
And actually, it's a people solution, people working together collaboratively, using technology and data analytics, provide a route out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would wholeheartedly back that statement. And I think that working collaboratively and working together, it goes against the narrative of competition, which is, it's kind of hard to get your head around. How can I be working? I'm ops and supply chain, so I'm trying to put myself in a HR hat. But how can I work with my competitors when what I'm meant to be doing is working with my people internally? So I suppose it's a bit of a glass shattering perspective to take, but if we are going to try to solve it, that's what we need to be doing.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree there. And, we've seen time and time again the movements that have shattered some of these illusions. If you think about fair trade, that's exactly what they did. What they said was, do you know what? Let's question the middleman. Let's go out directly and work directly. Let's understand the whole path. And then let's all work together, because when we all work together, we provide something very exciting. And what's good for the planet, good for people, and this comes back to, if you think about the contemporary genre, if it's good for the people, it's good for the organization, it's good for the stakeholder, and the stakeholder in this place is the planet, is us as citizens of the globe. So it's a real good story, although it's a very sometimes quite distressing story when you're actually unearthing some of the challenges that are going on. And I just wanted to, we've talked all about this, and I'm very, very aware that we're moving into a new language. Mm-hmm. And it's a new language that sometimes is difficult to take on board, to absorb, to recognize, but for new steps, new contemporary spaces, when we start disrupting our thinking, then we need a new language for that disruption. Mm-hmm. And once that becomes a shared language, a common language, it becomes much easier to open up and discuss it because we start getting a shared understanding of what is happening. And that's why I've put some of these quotes, these new languages, and I know I'm missing some out. I mean, even in our conversation today, and I know we've had others, but we've started talking about this, moving from supply chain to a supply network, which is, if you think about it, it's moving from a linear perspective to this notion of a brain, that everything is connected. There's neural pathways all the time, and they're being reconnected, which I love, that sort of visual image of that. We've talked about this whole thing about leveraging data, but leveraging data for the good, to actually start seeing these patterns of behavior, which are usually the unseen. It's what goes on below a surface. And from a HR perspective, often we do have access to that data. We just haven't used it in this way before. We know whose bank accounts we're paying to. We know what the name is. We know the bank numbers. We know addresses. We have all of that. We could actually use it more intelligently for good. Yeah. And again, that's at our choice. This is why I talked about HR have a choice. These are our choices that we can make. So there's the new language. I'm so pleased that we've done this interview, Ollie. It's been really, it's very exciting for me as an academic to people and people practices, and you're so passionate about it as well. I just find it absolutely riveting. So hopefully we'll do another couple of interviews around specific cases, so that you can go into and drill down into the detail of how they found it, but also the detail of the solution to come out of it. Because I think when people actually look at something that's similar to them, they feel hopeful. They can start picking up and learning from others, because what we don't want to do is keep reinventing the wheel. We haven't got the time.
Yeah, absolutely agreed.
So thank you very much, and I'm gonna stop recording now. But thank you so much for your contribution to this, the making of this.
Thanks, Deise.